Support for This News is So Gay comes from the LGBTQ Opportunity Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, leveraging philanthropy to empower LGBTQ communities. Welcome to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us. Here's what we're covering on this week's all-new episode of This News is So Gay. Anti-LGBTQ legislation continues to be introduced with mixed results all over the country. What's the latest that you need to know there? There was some really helpful LGBTQ public health information online, and now there's not. What the heck happened to it? There are yet again some people you might not know, but soon will in our latest round of Who the Heck Is That? And of course, queer joy. Where is our roundtable finding queer joy in the news right now? Roundtable is a fun word to use because we have one roundtable person this week, which sometimes happens. There's technical issues. That's okay because we're joined this week. It's just me, and I shouldn't say just. It is gloriously me and politics and news editor at The Advocate, leading national coverage at the intersection of public policy, politics, and LGBTQ lives. Based in Washington, D.C., he oversees reporting from the White House, Congress, the Supreme Court, and federal agencies, and guides coverage across The Advocate, Out, Them, and Pride.com, and also GLAAD Award winner Christopher Wiggins. It's just me and you today, buddy.
It's a whole mouthful, but thank you for having me.
It's such a treat to have you back. Our LGBTQ reporters roundtable of, me and Christopher Wiggins, we are now assembled. So let's dive in. Well, we have to start where we've been starting by asking, how are queer journalists doing right now? We did have some name suggestions for this segment, some which were too snarky even for me. So if you have a suggestion for this segment, you can email me, editor@thebuckeyeflame.com. And if we select your suggestion, we will get you a Buckeye Flame, coveted Buckeye Flame hoodie. We do want to thank listener AB who suggested spoon inventory as a measure of a certain number of spoons that represent remaining mental and emotional capacity. But for now, let's just stick with how are queer journalists doing. Christopher Wiggins, how are you doing?
Honestly, I'm trying to keep my sanity a little. Tsunami of news right now does feel unsettling, especially when you cover politics and LGBTQ issues. There's always another breaking story. There's always another court ruling, another attack, another thing developing 5 minutes before you think you're done for the day. Um, and I think I may have mentioned this before. I've been trying to really intentionally stay grounded outside of work. And one of the things that brings me the most joy is my backyard. I have 7 hummingbird feeders that have essentially attracted the entire civilization of hummingbirds on the East Coast. My traveler's palm, which is a fancy plant from Madagascar, is thriving on my back deck. My bird of paradise plants are finally exploding again. And all of the other little tropical things that I acquire and plant and then keep over the winter indoors and bring out to come back to life are doing their thing. So, I guess long answer short, I'm doing all right.
Because I have to say, is it fair to call you prolific? Because I would describe you as prolific. You are writing a lot of pieces each week.
I am writing a whole lot. My fingers are often on fire, but thank you to Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, program that I guess I'm really dating myself, but thanks to typing classes and keyboarding class in high school, I'm pretty quick with the fingers. I have a pretty fast word per minute. So I'm writing a lot. I'm keeping really busy, but someone has to do it, so why not me?
And you are doing it. Well, let's dive into some of that latest news. As you covered there in The Advocate, the American Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking 529 anti-LGBTQ bills in state legislatures this year. I think we can increase that to 530 because we just got a new one in Ohio. Tell us, let's just pick a state and talk about it. What's going on in Missouri right now, Christopher?
Yeah, so what's interesting in Missouri is that we're starting to see some cracks in what had been this years-long wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation. Missouri Republicans introduced 58 anti-LGBTQ bills this legislative session. And according to the state LGBTQ advocacy group Promo, that was mirroring the national wave that you mentioned with now the 530 bills that the ACLU is tracking. But despite this wave of legislation, advocates in Missouri say that only one anti-trans measure ultimately became law, and that happened before the session adjourned. Several other proposals targeting transgender Missourians, drag performers, schools, diversity initiatives ultimately stalled, or they failed after months of organizing, testimony, and lobbying efforts, which, is great because so many people are standing up to fight against this stuff. At the same time, Promo did note that one disputed provision tied to the state appropriations process was unlikely to have practical effects because Missouri lawmakers generally can't legislate substantive policy through the budget process. And language like that is often stripped out before implementation. So, if you wanted to take it on balance, you could say that not a single anti-LGBTQ measure ultimately would affect people coming out of this session. I think it speaks to the larger climate right now. There's the constant flood of proposals, amendments, hearings, political messaging around LGBTQ people. And part of the challenge for journalists and advocates and communities is sorting out what poses an immediate legal threat, what's a symbolic political signal, and what's likely to survive implementation or court scrutiny. And it's a lot to dig through. But advocacy groups also make clear that even failed bills or symbolic proposals still have real emotional impact. When lawmakers spend months debating whether LGBTQ people should have access to healthcare, schools, sports, public life, that creates fear and an instability that is regardless of whether every proposal ultimately makes it to law, right? So it's hard to celebrate that they didn't pass any of these measures when the damage is almost done in that they've been publicized. The attacks have been built around them. So I think, Missouri really captures both realities at once that the anti-LGBTQ legislative push absolutely continues on one hand, but that it's also facing more pushback and that this pushback is successful and that it's not just noise and that people's actions do have consequences. And so on balance, you know, I think when it comes to Missouri, it's a good example of how advocacy works to stall some of these measures. And that's happened in some other states too.
What are your thoughts from the journalism perspective? I know that we often get pushback at the Buckeye Flame when we cover a new bill that, yes, it isn't likely to go anywhere, but that doesn't mean we're not going to cover it. We didn't propose the bill, right? We are just saying,
Yeah.
hey, by the way, here is something that Republicans have, and for us here in Ohio, factually, it is Republicans. Quite frankly, it is one specific Republican, a Black Republican House representative named Josh Williams, who has proposed now 114 bills. And it's where most of the anti-LGBTQ plus bills are coming from. Now, will these bills pass by the end of this year, by the end of 2026, which is the end of our 2-year session? Probably not, but that doesn't mean we're not going to cover it. We're not doing it to grab headlines. This is factually being introduced.
I had a similar situation a week or two ago with a story that involved Congressman Vindman, Eugene Vindman of Virginia, where he had weeks earlier kind of told me that he stands behind LGBTQ people and is that progress cannot be changed or stopped. And then he voted for this national "Don't Say Trans" bill that ultimately passed the House, but has no chance of passing the Senate because it can't overcome the filibuster. Democrats won't vote for it. And the conversation online became about, well, maybe he was just given permission to vote for the bill because he represents a conservative area. And knowing that that the bill would not pass. Maybe this was just an opportunity to keep him on the good side of the voters while also not doing any actual harm. And, I'll leave others to decide whether that does harm or not. I certainly think that, it was perfectly fair for us to point out that he had said this super positive thing about the LGBTQ community to me weeks earlier and then had voted to out trans kids involuntarily to their parents on the
Yeah.
other. And so, you know, that really kind of solidified this issue for me, from a reporting point of view, just a few days ago.
Well, Pride season is almost here. In fact, I know that Pride celebrations have already started here in Ohio. So let's just say that we are already in Pride season. Christopher, there was some LGBTQ plus public health information online tied to Pride events. And now there seems to not be that same LGBTQ plus public health information online tied to Pride events. What happened there?
Yeah, so this is something that really frustrated me when I first discovered it last week and then found it to be true. The CDC quietly removed LGBTQ specific public health guidance tied to Mpox prevention and Pride events. I reviewed the archived version of the page through the Wayback Machine and saw that the underlying documents still appear in the text of the page, but the public facing links have disappeared. So that's the one thing. What made it especially striking is that the guidance was actually practical and super direct. It talked about things like pride events, hookups, sex clubs, social gatherings, vaccinations, reducing risk, safer sex during an infectious disease outbreak, and just really great information. Public health experts told me that the directness was intentional because euphemisms and stigma have historically failed queer communities during health crises. And, I interviewed Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis, who is the chief medical officer at Callen Lord in New York City, but who is also the deputy MPOX coordinator under the Biden administration in the White House. He helped to lead the federal MPOX response in that administration. And he's also one of the country's most trusted LGBTQ public health experts. He told me very bluntly that he and others in public health have learned lessons from HIV. His argument was basically that public health only works when people trust institutions enough to access accurate information without shame and without confusion. He took that back to the Reagan era when, famously that administration ignored HIV and AIDS and wouldn't even speak it. And so, he said that that is something that obviously needs to be fought against in this situation. He said what is especially notable is that HHS actually admitted that they did this. A spokesperson told me, quoting here, this page was not medically accurate and does not align with the administration's priorities, which is wild because not only is it all accurate information, but the agency never explained what information they believe is inaccurate, and several doctors and health experts strongly disputed that characterization in conversation with me. And so, what's concerning a lot of advocates is that this comes right after a federal judge already ruled that the administration violated LGBTQ and HIV related public health information laws when it removed that from government websites, including the CDC website last year. So, while they then put up this disclaimer that essentially said, yeah, okay, this is health information. We don't really believe it because we don't believe that LGBTQ people exist, but we're forced to put this here. They've gotten rid of that and totally just deleted the page off of it, off of the site altogether. And I think a lot of people, this also felt symbolic because Pride, as you said, is beginning now. This is where the LGBTQ community gathers, shares spaces, goes to very close quarters dance events and, it has close skin to skin contact in many ways. And here you have this resource being taken away. And so when guidance tied to the queer community and health and safety information disappears right before Pride season, I think people notice that.
Especially as we covered on an episode a few weeks ago, out in California, well documented that Mpox is back on the rise again. So, really important information to
Yeah.
put out there. My gosh, covering disappearing information. This is a whole new challenge for us that we are navigating. Well, let's play just one round of one of my favorite segments. It is, of course, who the heck is that? This is where we tell you about some LGBTQ plus folks whose names you might not know, but should. And I had no idea. Now, putting it in context, given your outside of journalism gardening life, I suspect this was a very fulfilling piece for you, Christopher Wiggins. Tell everybody, who are the gardening gays?
I love the gardening gay story because it's such a reminder how queer life doesn't only exist in big cities or in political spaces. Here you have these two married gay men, Kevin Graham and Dragon Corbelicia, who left DC, moved to rural Virginia, and put up this massive sign on a major highway that literally says Gardening Gays Farm. And I actually went down to the farm to report for this story. And what struck me immediately was how deeply woven into the community they've become. People stop because of the eggs and the produce, but they stay because Kevin and Dragon make everybody there feel welcome. They've become beloved local figures in this really conservative community. They've won local business awards. They serve on the tourism committees, and they built this huge following online and locally. But at the same time, you still see reminders that queer visibility can make some people a little uncomfortable because, this is a little frustrating in the conversation that we had because they do seem so beloved in their community. Early on, they worked with local schools. They donated pumpkins and hosted like planting days and welcomed students to the farm. And then one parent complained because they wore gardening gays hoodies to the classroom. And the sheriff actually got called and went out to the farm. And Dragon and Kevin told me sat at their kitchen table afterward, noted that nothing inappropriate was happening. But since that, they've largely stopped doing direct school partnerships because they just don't want the trouble that comes with that. And they say that, kids are really missing out. They still quietly donate to the schools and still support in that way, but it's just, odd that that one parent was able to kind of ruin this experience for all of the kids. But that's another thing with them. They were really mostly sad for the kids, not themselves. The farm itself feels magical. There are lambs and sheep and chickens and orchards and gardens, and there are 5 dogs. At one point, Dragon insisted that I bottle feed baby lambs, which was very interesting. So I'm sitting there in an upside down bucket with like 2 huge bottles in my hands, and these lambs were urgently like wanting to have what was in there. And I'm sitting there, like, double fisting, like, lamb bottles. The dog is sitting there watching this whole thing. I really kind of felt like I was in some sort of, like, Disney movie. The rain started, and it was, like, on the tin roof, the rain was kind of tippering down, and it was a wonderful experience. And, I think what I loved most about the story is that it wasn't really about politics. Kevin described that what they're doing is soft power, just two openly gay men building something beautiful, feeding people, caring for animals, and showing that queer life can exist openly and joyfully anywhere. And honestly, spending time there felt like stepping into a completely different vision of America than the one we usually see, in political headlines and in the news.
Two follow-up questions. Question number one, what percentage were you writing an article and what percentage were you actually interviewing for a job there as to be a gardening gay?
Well, I will say, like, it's a real working farm, and they have to, like, get up and do farm chores and stuff like that, and I'm more of, like, a fancy gay who likes his, you know, tropical plants on the deck and not working the field, so I wasn't really applying for a job there, but, I did ask them for some tips about my plants, and so, I do trust the experts there.
Question number 2, follow up. Did you get I will be so disappointed if the answer is no. So know that the answer of no will disappoint me. Did you get a gardening gaze hoodie?
I did get a Garden
Oh,
Engaged
good.
hoodie. Yes. I got a Garden Engaged hoodie. They had to do a special order, but it is on its way. So
Okay.
I was able to get one. They do have a bunch of them in their like farm store, and because they're so popular, they often run out. And so mine is coming. Is that an okay answer?
100%. Please know that I was prepared to get you a Gardening Gaze hoodie for your birthday, whenever that may be. But for right now, the gift is this podcast because you all are listening to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck from the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ plus newsroom. Joining me this week, Christopher Wiggins from The Advocate. By the by, if you are not subscribed to This News is So Gay, what the heck are you waiting for? Subscribe to This News is So Gay right this very second on your favorite podcasting app so that new episodes automatically make their way to you. Well, it is time, folks. It is time for Glitter Bomb. This is where our roundtable shares stories of queer joy that they are seeing covered there in the news. So let's set off a glitter bomb. Other than the gardening gaze, Christopher Wiggins, give us another story of queer joy that you want us to know about.
So here's one. One thing that's genuinely giving me hope right now is seeing younger LGBTQ people refuse to disappear. Even in really hostile political environments. And so I spoke with, and we published a story today about Bentley Hudgens in Georgia, who's now poised to potentially become the first openly trans lawmaker elected in that state's history. What struck me about that race wasn't just the historic nature of it, but how deeply rooted their campaign was in everyday issues that people deal with in their lives. Bentley talks about things like housing insecurity, medical debt, infrastructure, economic survival, access to health care, clean water. At one point, they talked about sleeping in a pickup truck during a brutal Georgia summer after losing their housing and still working in activism. So the campaign never felt like symbolism for symbolism's sake. It felt very human. And I think that's part of what gives me real hope right now because there's this narrative that LGBTQ people, especially trans people, are only being discussed through legislation or political attacks. But then you go out and report on these stories and you meet people building community, running for office, creating farms, organizing locally, and helping others survive and refusing to shrink themselves. And I think queer joy right now looks less flashy than people imagine. Sometimes it's mutual aid, sometimes it's community garden, sometimes it's people feeding lambs on a gay farm in Virginia. Sometimes it's trans candidates knocking doors in Georgia talking about housing and democracy. But I think that there's a joy in all of that. And as we go into Pride Month, I do think that we need to, be aware that it's not all doom and gloom.
Can I also ask? I know for me, when I do have the capacity, which unfortunately is not always, to do a story on queer joy, to pen something, it also helps me a bit just get through everything else. Do you have the same experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I write a lot about tragedy and just negative things. And I make it a mission of mine to ensure that I also write about happy things or things that are at least optimistic and not necessarily rosy, but real, right? And there are stories of real people who are still experiencing joy, who are still able to do really impressive and great things, and telling those stories, I think, is kind of like a balm that you can coat yourself with, to protect against some of the darker stories that we work on day over day.
So very needed. Well, finally, The Broken Hearts Club, the queer film from the year 2000, is bafflingly having a bit of a resurgence. Dean Kane's current politics aside, a few articles have popped up asking if people have seen the Broken Hearts Club, which I have a lot. So for this week's quick queer culture question, Christopher, do you have a favorite LGBTQ plus film in that 1990 to 2000 realm?
You know that I'm a rule follower, but I like to bend them a bit. So I'm cheating a little bit because and I have 2. One of mine is technically a TV show, Queer as Folk,
Of
the
course.
original.
Wait, the original, hold on, hold on. The original American?
The original American, yes, the
Okay.
original American, sorry, good. Look at you,
I
you
know that British queer as folk like you have no idea. Yeah.
yes. So the US version, at that moment in my life, that was everything. I was in college, I was living on my own for the first time, I had just started going to gay clubs, and suddenly there was this show that depicted queer life as expansive and exciting and messy and emotional and sexual and complicated, and it felt like this glimpse into a world that I was just beginning to discover myself.
Yeah.
And obviously, parts of it feel very early 2000s now in retrospect, but at the time, it was huge. And for a lot of people, I think in my generation, it was one of those first times queer life wasn't just being presented entirely through tragedy or side characters or cautionary tales. These people had friendships and relationships and nightlife and ambition, and they were really broken and had heartbreak and joy and tragedy and ultimately community. So there's that. And then, the other one for me is Cruel Intentions, which maybe
Mm.
says something psychologically concerning about millennials and Gen Xers as a generation. But between the soundtrack and the drama and Sarah Michelle Gellar weaponizing manipulation as an art form, and of course Ryan Phillippe, that movie was absolutely everything and had a chokehold at the time. And so I think both of those choices really capture something about the area for queer people. There was this feeling of discovery and hidden worlds, and whether it was nightlife or queer friendship or independence or pop culture, everything started to kind of crack the door open. And that really is kind of the vibe that I get when I think of that period of time when it comes to TV and movies.
Although Queer as Folk gave us a really not accurate portrayal of Pittsburgh, I've now learned. Just so folks know, if folks are headed to Pittsburgh and expecting to encounter anything that resembles Queer as Folk, it is less than 2 hours away from where I currently sit in Cleveland. It is not like that. It also, I've told this story before, but I have to give my dad a shout out again. It came out at roughly the same time as the original Queer Eye, and Queer Eye was also something everyone was talking about. And I remember my dad called and said, I finally watched that Queer Eye. And I said, all right, well, what'd you think, Dad? And he said, it was too much. It was too much. It was too graphic. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, oh, the sex. And I said, no, no, no. You definitely just watched Queer as Folk, not Queer Eye. And please don't ever watch that again. So thanks a lot, Dad, for that allyship. Well, we certainly want to hear what you are working on. Christopher Wiggins, what's coming up for you, sir?
I'm really excited about this story. It's one that I've been following for more than a year. Andre Hernandez Romero, the gay Venezuelan makeup artist and asylum seeker whose case drew international attention after he was deported by the Trump administration to that torture prison in El Salvador, CICOT. I spoke with him last week. He is now in Spain.
Mm.
It was a really emotional conversation because he talked very openly about survival and displacement, and I get the sense that he also has some guilt because his case got a lot of attention, but he's very forthcoming and makes sure to mention the other men who were also sent to the prison. What stayed with me too was that he was very direct about messages he had for his supporters. He's in one sense overwhelmed by the amount of support that he has received, not only in the US, but around the world, but, also struggles with nightmares and the trauma that comes from having gone through something like that. And, he said that, he has a pretty good Instagram page now that he puts information out on it, but he admits that, what you see on social media is just a really small, curated cross section of what someone's life was like. And that he said what people don't see is the struggle that he still goes through now. He also had a message for the US government and for Kamala Harris. So that's really interesting. And talked about a lot about, just not abandoning vulnerable immigrants who are still being held captive in essentially concentration camps just here in the US. So, I think that people will be heartened to hear from him, to hear how he's doing and what life is like for him now that he's no longer in Venezuela. But I think folks will be really surprised to hear him, in his own words, describe how he is dealing with everything. That, I said to him, he would deserve to be bitter, and he's not bitter in any way, which is just remarkable to me.
I cannot wait to read that. That is sadly, my friends, all the time that we have for this week's episode. Christopher Wiggins from The Advocate, you are doing the thing. That's what I have to say about you. You are doing the thing. And I hope that you get as much appreciation as you deserve, both from all of us reading your content, but also from the queer journalism community, because you, again, I don't even have another way of saying it. You are just so clearly doing the thing, and it's helping all of us. So I thank you, sir.
Well, that's super kind of you to say. I do feel like I'm doing the thing. I don't think that it is that remarkable. This is a job that I love doing, and something that I, studied a long time to have the ability to do and get a lot of pleasure out of. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate every time I have to come on the show and talk to you.
Just plain adore you and your work. I'm Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame. And if you liked this episode of This News Is So Gay, please share it with a friend. Subscribe so that you do not miss out on our next episode. Send an email on over to editor@thebuckeyeflame.com. That's me, to let us know your thoughts, and rate and review us on your favorite podcasting app. This News Is So Gay is a product of the Buckeye Flame, a nonprofit newsroom. Become a recurring donor today for as little as $12.50 a month, which truly enables programming like this from a scrappy queer newsroom like ours. In the meantime, read LGBTQ+ news, share the stories from LGBTQ+ reporters, and support the work of LGBTQ+ newsrooms. Until next week, friends.